I lay paralyzed in the ICU, fully conscious but unable to move or speak, as my own family stood around my hospital bed discussing casket options and dividing my possessions, until my Navy SEAL husband walked through those doors and changed everything. This is the story of how a near-fatal accident revealed the shocking truth about the people I trusted most, and how discovering their betrayal became the catalyst for the most powerful transformation of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Martinez had always believed that family meant unconditional love and unwavering support. At 31 years old, she had built her entire identity around being the dependable daughter, the generous sister, and the devoted wife who put everyone else's needs before her own. Her life in Norfolk, Virginia revolved around maintaining harmony in relationships that she now realized had been slowly draining her spirit for years. Rachel worked as a pediatric nurse at Centara Norfolk General Hospital, a position that perfectly reflected her nurturing personality and desire to help others heal. The 12-hour shifts were demanding, but she found deep satisfaction in caring for children who needed her expertise and compassion. Her colleagues respected her clinical skills and emotional intelligence, often seeking her advice on difficult cases that required both medical knowledge and psychological insight. The irony was not lost on her that she spent her professional life advocating for vulnerable patients, while consistently failing to advocate for herself in her personal relationships. Rachel had developed an unconscious pattern of prioritizing everyone else's comfort and happiness, while minimizing her own needs and desires. This tendency had shaped every significant relationship in her life, creating dynamics that felt loving on the surface but were fundamentally unbalanced underneath. Her marriage to Lieutenant Commander David Martinez had begun as a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. David served as a Navy SEAL with SEAL Team 4, and their relationship had initially thrived on their common commitment to service and their ability to support each other through the demands of military life. David understood the psychological pressures of high-stakes work, and Rachel appreciated his dedication to protecting others through his specialized training and deployments. However, the reality of military marriage had proven more challenging than either of them had anticipated when they exchanged vows 4 years earlier. David's deployment schedule kept him away from home for months at a time, leaving Rachel to manage their household responsibilities and maintain connections with both of their extended families. The physical distance had gradually created emotional distance as well, with their communication becoming increasingly focused on logistics rather than intimate connection. During David's absences, Rachel had unconsciously filled the emotional void by becoming even more involved in her family's daily dramas and financial needs. Her parents, Miguel and Carmen Herrera, lived in a modest home in Virginia Beach that required constant maintenance and upgrades they could not afford on Miguel's warehouse supervisor salary and Carmen's part-time work at a local retail store. Rachel found herself regularly contributing to their household expenses, home repairs, and medical bills, without questioning whether this level of financial support was sustainable or appropriate. Her younger sister, Sophia, had recently graduated from college with a degree in marketing but struggled to find employment that matched her lifestyle expectations. Rather than accepting entry-level positions that would provide valuable experience, Sophia preferred to wait for opportunities that offered higher salaries and more prestigious titles. During this extended job search, she lived rent-free in Rachel and David's guest bedroom, while Rachel covered her car payments, insurance premiums, and personal expenses. Rachel's younger brother, Carlos, had followed a different but equally concerning path. At 26, he worked sporadically in construction while pursuing what he described as entrepreneurial ventures that never seemed to generate actual income. Carlos had a talent for presenting ambitious business plans that required initial investment from family members, but his projects consistently failed to produce the promised returns. Rachel had contributed thousands of dollars to various schemes over the years, always hoping that the next venture would finally provide Carlos with the stability and success he claimed to desire. The financial drain of supporting her extended family had become a source of increasing stress in Rachel's marriage, particularly during David's deployments, when she felt isolated and overwhelmed by competing demands. She had not shared the full extent of her family's financial dependence with David, partly because she felt protective of her relatives, and partly because she feared his disapproval of her inability to establish appropriate boundaries. Rachel's daily routine reflected the exhausting pattern of overcommitment that had become her normal way of living. She would wake at 5:30 each morning to prepare for her hospital shift, but before leaving for work, she would check her phone for messages from family members who needed assistance with various crises or requests. These morning communications often involved financial emergencies, transportation problems, or emotional support needs that required immediate attention and response. During her lunch breaks at the hospital, Rachel would handle family business rather than resting or socializing with colleagues. She would research contractors for her parents, home improvement projects, review Sophia's job applications and cover letters, or transfer money to Carlos for his latest business expenses. These activities left her feeling drained and anxious, rather than refreshed for the remainder of her shift. Evenings were typically consumed with phone calls from family members who needed to discuss their problems and seek advice about decisions that they seemed incapable of making independently. Rachel would spend hours listening to her mother's complaints about her father's health issues, Sophia's frustrations with the job market, and Carlos's excitement about new business opportunities that required additional funding. These conversations were emotionally exhausting and rarely resulted in any meaningful progress toward resolution of the underlying issues. The most troubling aspect of these family dynamics was the subtle but persistent message that Rachel's value was primarily measured by her willingness to provide financial and emotional support. Her family members expressed affection and gratitude, but their interactions were increasingly transactional rather than genuinely relational. Rachel had begun to suspect that her family's interest in her well-being was directly proportional to her ability to solve their problems and meet their needs. Despite these concerns, Rachel continued to prioritize her family's demands because she had internalized the belief that love required sacrifice, and that setting boundaries would be selfish and potentially damaging to the relationships she valued most. She told herself that her family members were going through temporary difficulties, and that her support was helping them build toward independence and stability. Rachel's social life had gradually diminished as her family obligations expanded. She had once enjoyed regular activities with friends from nursing school and colleagues from the hospital, but she now found herself declining invitations because she needed to be available for family emergencies, or because she lacked the emotional energy for social interaction after managing everyone else's problems throughout the day. Her relationship with David had suffered as well, though she had not fully acknowledged the extent of the deterioration until his most recent deployment began 6 months earlier. Their video calls had become brief and superficial, focused on practical matters rather than emotional connection. David seemed increasingly distant and frustrated with what he perceived as Rachel's inability to prioritize their marriage over her family's endless needs. The financial impact of Rachel's family support had also created tension in her marriage. Despite earning a substantial salary as an experienced pediatric nurse, Rachel struggled to maintain their household budget because significant portions of her income were regularly diverted to family members. She and David had been unable to save for the house they had planned to purchase, and their retirement contributions had been reduced to accommodate her family's ongoing financial requirements. Rachel had begun to experience physical symptoms of chronic stress, including frequent headaches, difficulty sleeping, and digestive issues that her physician attributed to anxiety and overwork. She recognized that her current lifestyle was unsustainable, but she felt trapped by family expectations and her own deeply ingrained patterns of people-pleasing and conflict avoidance. The morning of November 15th had begun like any other day in Rachel's carefully managed but increasingly fragile routine. She had awakened before dawn to prepare for another 12-hour shift at the hospital, checking her phone to find 3 text messages from family members who needed various forms of assistance before the day officially began. Her mother needed help scheduling a medical appointment, Sophia required advice about a job interview outfit, and Carlos wanted to discuss a new business opportunity that required immediate financial investment. As Rachel drove to work through the early morning darkness, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling across her shoulders like a heavy blanket that she could never quite remove. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary Tuesday would become the day that changed everything about her understanding of family, love, and her own worth as a human being. The pediatric intensive care unit at Centera Norfolk General was busy but manageable, with Rachel assigned to care for 3 young patients who required constant monitoring and specialized attention. She took pride in her ability to provide both clinical expertise and emotional comfort to children and families facing medical crises, and her work provided a sense of purpose and accomplishment that was increasingly absent from her personal life. During her lunch break, Rachel received a phone call from Carlos, who needed $2,000 to secure equipment for a landscaping contract that he claimed would generate substantial income over the next year. The conversation followed a familiar pattern, with Carlos presenting an opportunity that sounded promising but required immediate financial commitment from Rachel before she could thoroughly evaluate the business plan or verify the details of the proposed contract. Rachel found herself agreeing to transfer the money, despite her growing reservations about Carlos's entrepreneurial ventures and her own financial limitations. The decision reflected her established pattern of saying yes to family requests, even when logic and intuition suggested that she should decline or request additional information before committing resources. As she returned to her afternoon shift, Rachel felt the familiar combination of anxiety and resentment that accompanied most of her family interactions. She loved her relatives and wanted to support their success, but she was beginning to recognize that her assistance was not actually helping them develop independence or achieve sustainable progress toward their stated goals. The afternoon proceeded normally until Rachel received an urgent text message from Sophia, requesting immediate assistance with a car problem that had left her stranded at a shopping center 20 miles from the hospital. Sophia's car had broken down in the parking lot, and she needed Rachel to leave work early to provide transportation to a job interview that could not be rescheduled. Rachel felt torn between her professional responsibilities and her family obligations, a conflict that had become increasingly frequent as her relatives' demands for immediate assistance competed with her work commitments. She approached her supervisor to request early departure, knowing that leaving during her scheduled shift would create additional workload for her colleagues and potentially compromise patient care. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive to retrieve Sophia provided Rachel with time to reflect on the unsustainable pattern that her life had become. She was constantly responding to other people's emergencies, while neglecting her own needs and professional development. Her marriage was suffering, her health was declining, and her financial security was threatened by her inability to establish appropriate boundaries with family members, who seemed to view her as an unlimited resource, rather than a person with her own limitations and needs. As Rachel navigated the evening traffic toward Sophia's location, she had no way of anticipating that within hours, she would find herself in a situation that would force her to confront the true nature of her family relationships and make decisions that would fundamentally transform her understanding of love, loyalty, and self-worth. The events that were about to unfold would challenge everything Rachel believed about family dynamics and reveal truths about the people she trusted most that would initially devastate her, but ultimately liberate her from patterns of behavior that had been slowly destroying her spirit and her future prospects. The accident that would change Rachel's life forever was still several hours away, but the foundation for her transformation had already been established through years of observation, growing resentment, and unconscious recognition that her current path was leading toward exhaustion and disappointment, rather than fulfillment and genuine connection with people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. The accident that would forever alter Rachel Martinez's understanding of family loyalty occurred on a rain-slicked stretch of Interstate 64, approximately 15 minutes after she had retrieved Sophia from the shopping center parking lot. Rachel was driving her reliable Honda Accord through moderate evening traffic when an 18-wheeler truck experienced a catastrophic tire blowout in the adjacent lane, causing the massive vehicle to jackknife across multiple lanes of traffic. The physics of the collision were brutal and unforgiving. Rachel had approximately 2 seconds to react, as the truck's trailer swung toward her vehicle like a giant pendulum of steel and momentum. Her nursing training had taught her to respond quickly under pressure, but no amount of professional preparation could have equipped her for the split-second decision that would determine whether she and Sophia survived the next few moments. Rachel yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, attempting to avoid the truck's trajectory while simultaneously applying maximum braking pressure. The Honda's anti-lock braking system engaged with a violent chattering sensation as the vehicle skidded across wet asphalt toward the concrete barrier that separated the interstate from the drainage canal below. The impact occurred at 43 miles per hour, according to the accident reconstruction report that Rachel would read months later. The airbags deployed with explosive force, and Rachel experienced a moment of complete disorientation as her vehicle struck the barrier and rebounded into the path of an oncoming SUV. The secondary impact drove the Honda into a violent spin that ended when the passenger side slammed into a concrete support pillar with sufficient force to trigger every safety system in the vehicle. Rachel's last conscious memory before the medical trauma began was the sound of Sophia's screaming and the taste of blood in her mouth. The next several hours existed only in fragments of sensation and half-understood conversations between paramedics, emergency room physicians, and trauma surgeons, who worked to stabilize her condition and assess the extent of her injuries. The medical team at Centara Norfolk General's Trauma Center determined that Rachel had sustained a severe traumatic brain injury, multiple fractured ribs, a punctured lung, and extensive internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention. The neurosurgical team was particularly concerned about brain swelling that could result in permanent cognitive damage or death if not carefully managed through a combination of medication, surgical decompression, and induced coma. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the attending neurosurgeon, made the decision to place Rachel in a medically induced coma to reduce brain activity and allow the swelling to subside without causing additional neurological damage. The procedure involved administering powerful sedatives and paralytic agents that would render Rachel unconscious and immobile, while mechanical ventilation supported her respiratory function. Sophia had sustained only minor injuries in the accident, primarily bruising and superficial cuts from broken glass. However, the psychological trauma of witnessing Rachel's life-threatening injuries had left her in a state of emotional shock that required counseling and family support to process effectively. Sophia immediately contacted their parents and Carlos, initiating a family crisis response that would reveal dynamics Rachel had never fully understood. The first 48 hours following the accident were critical for Rachel's survival and recovery prospects. The medical team monitored her intracranial pressure continuously, adjusting medication dosages and treatment protocols based on real-time neurological assessments. Dr. Reeves explained to the family that Rachel's condition remained unstable and that the next several days would determine whether she would recover with minimal long-term effects or face permanent disability. Miguel and Carmen Herrera arrived at the hospital within 2 hours of receiving Sophia's phone call, their faces etched with genuine concern and fear for their daughter's welfare. Carlos drove through the night from his apartment in Richmond, arriving at the hospital exhausted but determined to support his family during this crisis. The immediate response from Rachel's relatives appeared to demonstrate the kind of unconditional love and solidarity that she had always believed characterized their family relationships. The intensive care unit at Centara Norfolk General was a sophisticated medical environment equipped with advanced monitoring systems and staffed by specialists who understood the complexities of treating severe trauma patients. Rachel's room was filled with electronic equipment that tracked her vital signs, brain activity, and respiratory function, while delivering precisely calibrated doses of medications designed to support her recovery process. Rachel's family established a vigil routine that allowed them to maintain constant presence at the hospital while managing their work schedules and personal responsibilities. Carmen took family medical leave from her retail position to remain at Rachel's bedside during the day, while Miguel visited each evening after completing his warehouse supervisor duties. Sophia and Carlos alternated weekend coverage, ensuring that Rachel was never alone during the uncertain early stages of her recovery. On the 4th day following the accident, Dr. Reeves made the decision to begin reducing Rachel's sedation levels to assess her neurological function and determine whether she could breathe independently without mechanical ventilation. This process, known as a sedation holiday, would allow the medical team to evaluate Rachel's cognitive responsiveness and motor function while maintaining her safety through continuous monitoring. The reduction in sedation medications produced an unexpected and medically fascinating result. Rachel's brain activity indicated that she was regaining consciousness and awareness, but the paralytic agents that had been administered to prevent movement during the critical phase of her treatment had not yet been fully metabolized. This created a rare but documented medical condition in which Rachel became fully conscious and aware of her surroundings while remaining completely unable to move, speak, or communicate her awareness to others. Dr. Reeves recognized the possibility of this condition, known as locked-in syndrome or pseudocoma, but the medical team could not immediately determine whether Rachel was truly conscious or simply displaying reflexive neurological responses. The distinction was critical for treatment planning, as conscious patients required different pain management protocols and psychological support compared to patients who remained genuinely unconscious. Rachel's experience of regaining consciousness while paralyzed was initially terrifying and disorienting. She could hear conversations around her hospital bed, understand the medical discussions about her condition, and feel physical sensations including pain from her injuries, but she could not respond or indicate her awareness to anyone. The sensation was similar to being trapped inside her own body, while the world continued around her without recognition of her consciousness. The first conversation Rachel heard clearly was between Dr. Reeves and her parents, discussing the medical team's assessment of her condition and the projected timeline for recovery. Dr. Reeves explained that Rachel's brain scans showed encouraging signs of healing, but that the extent of her neurological recovery would not be fully apparent until the medication effects had completely resolved and she could demonstrate cognitive and motor function. Miguel asked detailed questions about Rachel's prognosis and the likelihood of permanent disability, demonstrating the kind of informed advocacy that Rachel would have expected from loving parents facing their daughter's medical crisis. Carmen expressed concern about Rachel's pain levels and comfort, requesting assurance that the medical team was providing adequate care for her physical and emotional needs during this vulnerable period. The conversations Rachel overheard during the first day of her conscious but paralyzed state reinforced her belief that her family members were genuinely concerned about her welfare and committed to supporting her recovery process. Their discussions focused on medical considerations, logistics of maintaining hospital presence, and coordination of communication with David, who was being transported back from his deployment area to be with Rachel during her recovery. However, on the second day of Rachel's locked-in consciousness, the tone and content of her family's conversations began to shift in ways that would fundamentally challenge her understanding of their relationships and their genuine feelings about her condition. These changes occurred gradually, as her relatives became more comfortable with the hospital environment and began to believe that Rachel was unconscious and unable to hear their discussions. The transformation began with seemingly innocent comments about the financial implications of Rachel's extended hospitalization and the impact of her absence on their own economic situations. Carmen mentioned that she was losing income by taking unpaid leave to maintain her hospital vigil, and Miguel expressed concern about the additional gasoline expenses required for daily trips between Virginia Beach and Norfolk. Sophia raised questions about Rachel's employee health insurance coverage and whether the family would be responsible for medical costs that exceeded the policy limits. These conversations initially seemed like reasonable concerns about practical matters that needed to be addressed during a family medical crisis, and Rachel did not interpret them as indicative of anything other than responsible planning for uncertain circumstances. However, the discussions gradually evolved to include more troubling elements that revealed perspectives and priorities Rachel had never suspected. Carlos mentioned that Rachel's absence from work would eliminate the regular financial support that had been covering his business expenses, creating immediate cash flow problems for his latest entrepreneurial venture. Sophia expressed frustration that Rachel's hospitalization would prevent her from co-signing for an apartment lease that she had been planning to request once she found employment. The most disturbing conversation occurred on the evening of Rachel's 6th day in the ICU, when her family believed she was deeply unconscious and unlikely to be aware of their discussions. Miguel, Carmen, Sophia, and Carlos had gathered in Rachel's room after visiting hours to discuss practical matters related to her condition and their family's circumstances. Carmen began the conversation by mentioning that Dr. Reeves had indicated Rachel's recovery would likely require months of rehabilitation, and that there was significant uncertainty about whether she would regain full cognitive and physical function. The medical team could not guarantee that Rachel would be able to return to her demanding position as a pediatric nurse or maintain her previous level of independence and self-sufficiency. Miguel responded by noting that Rachel's potential disability would eliminate her ability to provide the financial support that had become essential to their family's economic stability. Without Rachel's regular contributions to their mortgage payments, home maintenance expenses, and medical bills, Miguel and Carmen would face immediate financial hardship that could result in losing their home or declaring bankruptcy. Sophia added that Rachel's condition had already created problems for her job search, as she had been required to cancel several interviews to maintain hospital vigil duties. More significantly, Sophia expressed resentment that Rachel's accident had occurred just when Sophia was beginning to establish independence and move towards self-sufficiency. Sophia had been depending on Rachel's continued financial support during her career transition, and Rachel's disability threatened to eliminate that assistance when Sophia needed it most. Carlos's contribution to the conversation was perhaps the most revealing and hurtful. He expressed frustration that Rachel's timing had been particularly unfortunate for his business development, as he had been counting on additional investment from Rachel to expand his landscaping operations during the spring season. Carlos had already committed to equipment purchases and employee hiring based on expected funding from Rachel, and her inability to provide that support would force him to abandon his expansion plans and potentially lose money he had already invested. The conversation that followed challenged every assumption Rachel had maintained about her family's love and loyalty. Her relatives began discussing the possibility that Rachel might not survive her injuries or might recover with such severe disabilities that she would require long-term care rather than being able to resume her previous lifestyle and financial contributions. Miguel suggested that if Rachel's prognosis remained uncertain, they should begin planning for scenarios that did not include her recovery to full independence. Carmen agreed that they needed to develop alternative strategies for managing their financial obligations without depending on Rachel's continued support. Sophia and Carlos supported this practical approach, noting that they had their own lives to build and could not sacrifice their futures to care for a disabled sister who might never again be able to contribute to the family's economic welfare. Rachel listened to these conversations with growing horror and disbelief, gradually recognizing that her family's primary concern was not her health and happiness, but rather the potential loss of financial support that her disability would represent. The people she had sacrificed for throughout her adult life were discussing her potential death or permanent disability primarily in terms of its impact on their own economic circumstances and personal convenience. The revelation that would complete Rachel's understanding of her family's true priorities occurred during a conversation between Sophia and Carlos, while their parents had temporarily left the hospital room to meet with social services personnel about insurance and discharge planning matters. Sophia and Carlos believed they were completely alone with Rachel's unconscious body, creating an opportunity for them to speak with complete honesty about their feelings and concerns. Sophia began by expressing frustration that Rachel's accident had dominated their family's attention and resources for more than a week, requiring everyone to rearrange their schedules and priorities to maintain hospital presence. Sophia felt that the vigil duties were preventing her from focusing on her job search and career development, which she considered more important than sitting beside Rachel's hospital bed performing essentially meaningless emotional support. Carlos agreed that the family's response to Rachel's condition had been excessive and potentially counterproductive. He noted that Rachel was receiving excellent medical care from professional staff, and that their constant presence at the hospital was not actually contributing to her recovery prospects. Carlos suggested that they could maintain concern for Rachel's welfare, while also prioritizing their own needs and obligations. The conversation that followed included statements that would forever change Rachel's understanding of her relationships with her siblings and her role within their family structure. Sophia admitted that she had always viewed Rachel as overly generous to the point of being financially irresponsible, and that Rachel's constant willingness to provide money and support had enabled Sophia to avoid developing independence and self-reliance. Carlos expressed similar sentiments, acknowledging that he had become accustomed to depending on Rachel's financial assistance for his business ventures, without seriously considering whether those ventures were viable or whether his requests for funding were reasonable and appropriate. Carlos had never viewed Rachel's support as temporary assistance designed to help him achieve independence, but rather as an ongoing resource that he could access whenever he needed additional capital for his projects. Both Sophia and Carlos admitted that they had occasionally discussed Rachel's generosity with a mixture of gratitude and resentment. They appreciated her willingness to provide financial support, but they also felt frustrated by the implicit expectations that came with her assistance. Rachel's help always seemed to include subtle suggestions about how they should manage their lives and careers, creating a dynamic that felt patronizing and controlling despite Rachel's good intentions. The most devastating revelation occurred when Sophia and Carlos began discussing what would happen to their family's financial situation if Rachel did not survive her injuries or recovered with disabilities that prevented her from returning to work. Rather than expressing grief about the potential loss of their sister, they focused primarily on the practical implications of losing their most reliable source of financial support. Sophia mentioned that she had been researching Rachel's employee benefits and insurance policies to determine whether the family would receive any death benefits or disability payments that could help offset the loss of Rachel's regular contributions. Carlos had been investigating whether Rachel's home could be sold to provide funds for the family's immediate needs if she was unable to return to independent living. The conversation concluded with Sophia and Carlos agreeing that they needed to begin developing independence from Rachel's financial support regardless of her recovery outcome. They recognized that their dependence on her generosity had become unhealthy and unsustainable, but their motivation for change was primarily self-interest rather than concern for Rachel's well-being or recognition of the burden they had placed on her. As Rachel listened to these conversations while lying paralyzed and unable to respond, she experienced a profound transformation in her understanding of family relationships and her own value as a human being. The people she had sacrificed for throughout her adult life viewed her primarily as a financial resource rather than as a beloved sister and daughter, worthy of unconditional love and support. The revelation was simultaneously devastating and liberating. Rachel felt heartbroken by the discovery that her family's love had been largely conditional on her ability to provide financial assistance. But she also experienced a growing sense of clarity about the dysfunction that had characterized these relationships for years. The accident that had nearly killed her was becoming the catalyst for insights that would ultimately transform her understanding of self-worth and authentic love. Rachel's consciousness existed in a liminal space between awareness and paralysis, where every thought carried the weight of betrayal, and every memory became evidence of relationships built on false foundations. The conversations she had overheard during the past 3 days replayed continuously in her mind, each revelation cutting deeper than the last as she processed the full implications of what she had discovered about her family's true priorities and motivations. The physical immobility that trapped Rachel within her own body became a metaphor for the emotional imprisonment she had unknowingly accepted throughout her adult life. Just as the paralytic medications prevented her from moving or speaking, her deeply ingrained patterns of people-pleasing and boundary avoidance had prevented her from recognizing and addressing the dysfunction that had slowly consumed her relationships with the people she loved most. Dr. Patricia Reeves had explained to Rachel's family that the locked-in state was temporary and that Rachel would gradually regain motor function as the medications cleared from her system. However, Rachel found herself questioning whether she truly wanted to emerge from this protective cocoon of silence and observation. The paralysis that everyone viewed as a medical problem had become her sanctuary, a space where she could finally see clearly without the obligation to immediately respond or accommodate others' needs and expectations. The internal dialogue that consumed Rachel's consciousness during these wakeful but immobilized hours was a battlefield between competing voices that had shaped her identity and decision-making processes for decades. The accommodating voice that had always prioritized harmony and family unity argued that she should forgive her relatives, conversations as stress-induced comments that did not reflect their true feelings about her welfare. This familiar voice insisted that families naturally discussed practical matters during medical crises, and that focusing on financial concerns did not necessarily indicate absence of genuine love and concern. Opposing this conciliatory perspective was a newer voice that had been growing stronger since Rachel had begun questioning her family dynamics months earlier. This voice of self-preservation and authentic assessment argued that what she had overheard represented the honest truth about her relationships, unfiltered by the social expectations and emotional manipulation that typically characterized her family interactions. This voice insisted that genuine love did not disappear under stress, but rather became more apparent when people believed they could speak without consequences. Rachel's nursing experience provided additional perspective on the situation she was observing from her hospital bed. Throughout her career, she had witnessed countless family crises that revealed the true character of relationships under pressure. She had seen families unite with extraordinary love and sacrifice for injured or ill relatives. And she had also observed families that disintegrated when medical circumstances created financial strain or caregiving obligations. The authentic families that Rachel respected most were those that focused primarily on the patient's comfort, recovery prospects, and emotional well-being, rather than the practical implications of illness for their own circumstances. These families discussed financial concerns and logistical challenges, but those conversations occurred in contexts that clearly prioritized the patient's welfare above all other considerations. Rachel's family had demonstrated the opposite pattern. Their discussions consistently centered on the impact of her condition on their own lives, with her actual recovery and emotional needs receiving secondary consideration. Even when they expressed concern about her physical comfort or medical care, those concerns seemed motivated more by obligation and social expectation than by genuine empathy and love. The most painful aspect of Rachel's analysis was recognizing how her own behavior had contributed to establishing and maintaining these unhealthy relationship dynamics. Her compulsive generosity and inability to establish appropriate boundaries had trained her family members to view her as a resource rather than as an individual deserving of mutual respect and consideration. She had inadvertently taught them that her value was primarily instrumental rather than intrinsic. Rachel's memories of family interactions over the past several years took on new significance as she reviewed them through the lens of her current understanding. She recalled countless conversations where family members had expressed gratitude for her financial assistance, while simultaneously requesting additional support for new problems or opportunities. The gratitude had always felt somewhat performative, delivered with the practiced sincerity of people who understood that appreciation was the price of continued access to resources. Similarly, Rachel remembered family gatherings, where she had felt increasingly isolated, despite being surrounded by relatives who claimed to value her presence and contributions. She had attributed this loneliness to her own social awkwardness or David's absence during deployments. But now she recognized that her family members had been relating to her role as a provider rather than engaging with her authentic personality and interests. The realization that her family's love had been largely conditional and transactional forced Rachel to confront fundamental questions about her own identity and self-worth. If the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally viewed her primarily in terms of her utility, what did that reveal about her inherent value as a human being? Had she unknowingly become someone whose only claim to love and belonging was her willingness to sacrifice her own needs for others' convenience? Rachel's internal struggle was complicated by the genuine love and concern she continued to feel for her family members, despite their betrayal of her trust and emotional investment. She could not simply dismiss years of shared history and emotional attachment because she had discovered that her relatives were more selfish and manipulative than she had previously understood. The complexity of loving people who had hurt her created cognitive and emotional dissonance that required careful processing and resolution. The nursing profession had taught Rachel to separate her personal feelings from her clinical responsibilities when caring for difficult or ungrateful patients. She had developed the ability to provide compassionate care for individuals who were demanding, hostile, or unappreciative, while maintaining professional boundaries that protected her emotional well-being. However, applying similar principles to family relationships felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Rachel found herself analyzing whether her family members were capable of genuine change and growth, or whether their fundamental character traits made them unsuitable for the kind of authentic relationships she now recognized she needed and deserved. Sophia and Carlos were young adults who might eventually develop greater maturity and empathy as they gained life experience and faced their own challenges. However, Miguel and Carmen were well established in their patterns of dependence and entitlement, making significant change less likely at their stage of life. The question of forgiveness became central to Rachel's internal processing during these days of forced reflection and analysis. Her religious upbringing and professional training had instilled strong beliefs about the importance of forgiveness for both interpersonal relationships and personal emotional health. However, Rachel was beginning to understand that forgiveness did not necessarily require continuing to enable harmful behavior or accepting treatment that violated her dignity and well-being. Rachel's contemplation of forgiveness led to deeper questions about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, between loving people from a distance and maintaining close relationships that facilitated continued exploitation. She could potentially forgive her family members for their selfishness and manipulation, while simultaneously establishing boundaries that prevented future harm to her financial security and emotional well-being. The prospect of fundamentally altering her family relationships created significant anxiety and grief for Rachel. These people had been the primary source of emotional connection and social identity throughout her adult life, despite the dysfunction that had characterized their interactions. Distancing herself from them would require developing new sources of community and support, while accepting the loneliness that might accompany such a transition. Rachel's marriage to David represented another complex element in her internal struggle. David had expressed frustration with her family's financial dependence and her inability to establish appropriate boundaries, but he had not fully understood the extent of the dysfunction or the emotional manipulation that had made boundary setting so difficult for Rachel. His upcoming return from deployment would provide an opportunity to share her revelations and potentially strengthen their relationship through honest communication about the challenges they both faced. However, Rachel also recognized that her relationship with David had suffered damage that would require intentional effort and possibly professional counseling to repair effectively. The financial strain created by her family support had limited their ability to achieve shared goals and build the future they had envisioned when they married. The emotional energy she had devoted to managing family crises had left less available for nurturing their marital relationship and developing deeper intimacy and partnership. The prospect of David's return created both anticipation and apprehension for Rachel. She needed his support and understanding as she processed her family revelations and developed strategies for establishing healthier relationships. However, she also feared that David might struggle to forgive the extent to which she had prioritized her family's demands over their marriage's well-being, particularly given the sacrifices he had made through his military service to provide financial security for their household. Rachel's internal dialogue during these immobilized days also focused on practical considerations related to her recovery and future independence. The medical team had indicated that she would likely require several months of rehabilitation to regain full physical and cognitive function following her traumatic brain injury. This recovery period would provide natural distance from her family obligations while she focused on her own healing and development. The rehabilitation process would also offer opportunities for Rachel to work with therapists and counselors who could help her develop communication skills and boundary-setting strategies that would serve her well in future family interactions. She could use this time to create a comprehensive plan for transforming her relationships while building greater emotional and financial independence. Rachel's nursing background provided insight into the rehabilitation process and the importance of approaching recovery with realistic goals and systematic planning. She understood that brain injury recovery required patience, persistence, and willingness to accept help from qualified professionals. The parallels between physical rehabilitation and emotional healing were significant, and Rachel recognized that both processes would demand similar commitment and strategic thinking. The financial implications of her extended medical absence also required careful consideration. Rachel's employee health insurance would cover most of her medical expenses, and she qualified for short-term disability benefits that would provide partial income replacement during her recovery period. However, her inability to work would eliminate the extra income that had been supporting her family members, creating an opportunity for them to develop greater independence while removing her ability to continue enabling their financial dependence. Rachel's contemplation of her family's financial future without her support produced a complex mixture of concern and satisfaction. She genuinely hoped that Miguel, Carmen, Sofia, and Carlos would use this crisis as motivation to develop greater self-sufficiency and problem-solving capabilities. However, she also felt a sense of justice in knowing that they would finally experience the consequences of their dependence and entitlement without the safety net that her generosity had provided. The most transformative aspect of Rachel's internal struggle was the gradual emergence of a new vision for her life that prioritized her own well-being and authentic relationships over the dysfunctional family dynamics that had consumed so much of her emotional and financial resources. This vision included a stronger marriage with David, built on honest communication and shared priorities rather than the competing obligations that had created tension between them. Rachel also envisioned pursuing professional development opportunities that she had previously declined due to family obligations and financial constraints. She had always been interested in advancing her education and potentially specializing in pediatric trauma nursing or nurse practitioner training. The elimination of family financial support would free resources for her own educational investments, while allowing her to focus on career goals rather than constantly responding to family emergencies. The new life vision that emerged from Rachel's forced reflection included intentional community building with people who valued her for her character, intelligence, and compassion, rather than her willingness to solve their problems or fund their lifestyle choices. She wanted friendships based on mutual respect and reciprocal support, rather than the one-sided relationships that had characterized most of her adult social connections. As Rachel lay paralyzed but increasingly clear about her future direction, she began to recognize that the accident that had nearly killed her was becoming the catalyst for the most important transformation of her life. The devastating revelation about her family's true priorities was simultaneously the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, marking her transition from unconscious enabling to conscious boundary setting and from external validation to internal self-worth. The internal struggle that had consumed her consciousness during these days of physical immobility was preparing her for the external actions that would be required once she regained the ability to move and speak. The conversations she had overheard while locked in her paralyzed state had provided the clarity and motivation necessary for making fundamental changes in her relationships and life priorities. Rachel understood that the most difficult part of her journey was still ahead, as she would need to translate her internal insights into external actions that would inevitably create conflict and disappointment among people who preferred the previous version of herself. However, the strength she was developing through this forced reflection was building the foundation for courage and persistence that would serve her well in the challenges to come. On the 9th day following her accident, Rachel Martinez made the conscious decision that would mark the beginning of her transformation from passive victim to empowered advocate for her own well-being. The decision crystallized during the early morning hours when the intensive care unit maintained its quietest atmosphere, providing her with uninterrupted time to process the revelations of the previous week and formulate a strategic response to the circumstances that had been revealed through her family's unguarded conversations. The catalytic moment occurred when Dr. Patricia Reeves arrived for her morning rounds and began conducting the neurological assessments that would determine whether Rachel had regained sufficient motor control to attempt communication. The medical team had been gradually reducing the paralytic medications over the past 48 hours, and Dr. Reeves expected to observe some return of voluntary muscle movement if Rachel's neurological recovery was progressing according to the anticipated timeline. Rachel realized that she possessed a choice that would fundamentally determine the trajectory of her relationships and her future independence. She could emerge from her locked-in state immediately and confront her family with the knowledge she had gained through overhearing their conversations. Or she could maintain the appearance of continued unconsciousness, while gathering additional information and developing a comprehensive strategy for addressing the dysfunction she had discovered. The decision required careful consideration of multiple factors, including the medical implications of delaying her apparent recovery, the potential psychological benefits of extended observation time, and the strategic advantages of allowing her family members to continue revealing their authentic thoughts and priorities without awareness that she was monitoring their conversations. Dr. Reeves began her examination by testing Rachel's reflexes and responses to various stimuli, including light pressure on her fingernails, verbal commands to move specific body parts, and requests to squeeze her hand or blink her eyes in response to questions. Rachel possessed the motor control necessary to respond to these tests, but she made the strategic decision to remain motionless and unresponsive, effectively extending her locked-in state through conscious choice rather than medical necessity. The deception required significant mental discipline and emotional control. Rachel needed to suppress her natural inclination to respond to Dr. Reeves commands while simultaneously managing the psychological stress of continuing to deceive medical professionals who were working diligently to support her recovery. However, she recognized that this temporary deception would provide invaluable insights that could inform her decisions about how to proceed with her family relationships once she chose to reveal her consciousness. Dr. Reeves concluded her examination by explaining to Miguel, Carmen, Sofia, and Carlos that Rachel's lack of responsiveness indicated that her neurological recovery was progressing more slowly than initially anticipated. The medical team would continue reducing medications and monitoring her condition, but they should prepare for the possibility that Rachel's return to consciousness might require additional time and that her cognitive function might be impaired when she eventually awakened. This medical assessment created an immediate shift in Rachel's family dynamics that provided her with additional evidence about their true priorities and motivations. The prospect of extended unconsciousness or permanent cognitive impairment prompted conversations that revealed even more disturbing attitudes about Rachel's value and their obligations toward her future care and support. Miguel's initial response focused on the financial implications of Rachel's extended hospitalization and potential long-term care requirements. He expressed concern about whether their health insurance would cover indefinite medical treatment, and whether the family would become financially responsible for care costs that exceeded policy limitations. Miguel's questions to Dr. Reeves demonstrated greater interest in cost containment than in Rachel's actual recovery prospects or quality of life considerations. Carmen's reaction revealed similar priorities wrapped in more emotionally manipulative language. She spoke about the sacrifices the family was making to maintain their hospital vigil, and expressed frustration that Rachel's condition was creating ongoing stress and disruption for everyone involved. Carmen suggested that perhaps they should consider transferring Rachel to a long-term care facility where she could receive professional attention without requiring constant family presence and emotional investment. Sofia and Carlos supported their parents' practical approach to Rachel's condition, agreeing that the family needed to develop realistic expectations about Rachel's recovery timeline and their own obligations during an extended medical situation. Sofia mentioned that she had postponed her job search indefinitely due to the family crisis, and Carlos noted that his business opportunities were being compromised by the time and attention he was devoting to hospital visits and family coordination. The conversation that followed provided Rachel with definitive confirmation that her family viewed her primarily as a burden, rather than as a beloved relative deserving of unconditional support during a medical crisis. They discussed the possibility of consulting with social services about long-term care options and expressed relief at the prospect of transferring responsibility for Rachel's well-being to professional caregivers who would not require the emotional investment and schedule disruption that family care involved. Rachel's decision to maintain her apparent unconsciousness while observing these conversations required her to develop previously untapped reserves of emotional strength and strategic thinking. The pain of hearing her family discuss her potential warehousing in a care facility was excruciating, but she recognized that this information was essential for making informed decisions about her future relationships and the boundaries she would need to establish to protect her well-being. The most valuable insight that emerged from Rachel's extended observation period was understanding the specific language and reasoning that her family members used to justify their self-serving decisions. They consistently framed their preferences in terms of practical necessity and family welfare, using terminology that suggested concern for Rachel's best interests, while actually prioritizing their own convenience and financial security. This pattern of manipulative language had characterized Rachel's family relationships for years, but she had previously interpreted their words at face value, rather than analyzing the underlying motivations and priorities that drove their requests and suggestions. Her current position as a hidden observer allowed her to recognize the discrepancy between their stated concerns and their actual intentions. Rachel began developing a mental framework for future interactions with her family members that would account for their tendency toward emotional manipulation and self-serving interpretation of situations. She would need to evaluate their statements and requests based on demonstrated behavior and revealed priorities rather than accepting their explanations and justifications without critical analysis. The strategic planning that consumed Rachel's consciousness during her extended locked-in period included detailed consideration of how she would reveal her awareness to different people and in what sequence. She decided that Dr. Reeves should be the first person to learn about her consciousness, allowing her to discuss the medical and ethical implications of her extended observation period, while seeking guidance about how to proceed with her family. Rachel also planned to contact David before revealing her consciousness to her family members, providing him with complete information about what she had discovered, and seeking his support for the difficult conversations and boundary-setting actions that would be necessary once her family learned that she had been aware of their discussions. David's military training and deployment experience had taught him to think strategically about complex situations, and Rachel valued his perspective on how to approach the challenges she was facing. The development of communication strategies occupied significant portions of Rachel's mental energy during these days of voluntary silence. She needed to prepare specific language for addressing her family's behavior without becoming defensive or emotional in ways that would undermine her credibility and effectiveness. The conversations would require her to present evidence of their self-serving priorities, while maintaining enough emotional control to enforce whatever boundaries she decided to establish. Rachel's nursing background provided valuable insights into effective communication during difficult family discussions. She had witnessed countless conversations between medical teams and family members who were struggling to accept difficult diagnoses or treatment recommendations. The most successful communications were characterized by clear, factual presentations of information, combined with empathetic acknowledgement of emotional reactions, and plenty of time for questions and processing. However, Rachel recognized that her family communications would be complicated by the personal nature of the issues and the defensive reactions that her observations would likely provoke. Her family members would probably deny or minimize the significance of their conversations, claim that she had misunderstood their intentions, or argue that stress had caused them to speak in ways that did not reflect their true feelings about her welfare. The preparation for these anticipated defensive reactions required Rachel to develop both emotional resilience and strategic responses that would prevent her family from manipulating her through guilt, gaslighting, or emotional appeals. She needed to remain focused on documented behavior and express priorities rather than allowing herself to be drawn into arguments about interpretations or intentions. Rachel's planning process also included consideration of practical steps she would need to take to establish financial independence and reduce her family's access to her resources. She would need to change her banking arrangements to prevent unauthorized access to her accounts, revise her will and insurance beneficiaries to reflect her new understanding of her family relationships, and potentially seek legal advice about protecting her assets from family members who might attempt to claim financial responsibility for her care as justification for accessing her resources. The prospect of taking these protective measures created significant emotional turmoil for Rachel, as they represented the practical implementation of her recognition that her family could not be trusted to prioritize her well-being over their own financial interests. However, she understood that protecting herself financially was essential for maintaining the independence necessary to enforce whatever boundaries she decided to establish. Rachel's extended period of conscious observation also provided opportunities to evaluate the medical staff and other hospital personnel who would potentially serve as allies and advocates during her recovery process. She was particularly impressed by Dr. Reeves' professionalism and patient-centered approach to medical care, recognizing that the neurosurgeon could provide valuable guidance about recovery planning and family communication strategies. The hospital social worker, Jennifer Walsh, had also demonstrated competence and empathy during her interactions with Rachel's family, and Rachel considered requesting private consultation with Walsh about resources for managing difficult family dynamics during medical recovery. Walsh's professional training in family systems and crisis intervention could provide valuable insights and practical strategies for the challenges Rachel was anticipating. Rachel's observations of nursing staff interactions with her family also provided useful information about how her relatives presented themselves to outsiders and how they managed their public image, while expressing more authentic attitudes in private conversations. This information would be valuable for understanding how her family might respond to external scrutiny or professional involvement in their relationship dynamics. The decision about when to reveal her consciousness became increasingly complex, as Rachel gathered more information and developed greater clarity about the scope of changes she wanted to implement in her life. She recognized that emerging from her locked-in state would immediately trigger a series of conversations and decisions that would be difficult to control or reverse, making careful preparation essential for achieving the outcomes she desired. Rachel ultimately decided that she would reveal her consciousness to Dr. Reeves during the morning of her 10th day in the intensive care unit, allowing her to coordinate her emergence with David's return from deployment and ensuring that she would have medical and personal support available during the difficult family confrontations that would inevitably follow her revelations about their observed conversations. The night before her planned emergence, Rachel experienced a complex mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and determination as she prepared to transition from passive observation to active engagement with the people and circumstances that had shaped her life for so many years. The locked-in period had provided her with invaluable insights and strategic preparation time, but the real test of her transformation would begin once she started speaking and taking action based on what she had learned. Rachel understood that revealing her consciousness would mark the end of her protected observation period and the beginning of a challenging process of implementing the insights and decisions she had developed during her enforced silence. The courage required for this transition represented the first significant step in her journey, from unconscious enabling to conscious boundary setting, and from external validation to internal self-worth. The awareness that she possessed the power to choose when and how to emerge from her medical situation provided Rachel with a sense of agency and control that had been absent from her family relationships for years. This experience of making strategic decisions based on her own assessment of circumstances and priorities would serve as a foundation for the more complex decision-making processes that would be required as she rebuilt her relationships and redefined her role within her family system. Rachel Martinez's deliberate extension of her apparent unconsciousness transformed her hospital room into an intensive learning laboratory, where she systematically analyzed family dynamics, communication patterns, and psychological manipulation techniques that had shaped her relationships for decades. The 10 additional days she spent in conscious observation provided unprecedented access to unfiltered family conversations and strategic planning time that would prove invaluable during her eventual emergence and confrontation with the dysfunction she had discovered. The educational process that consumed Rachel's consciousness during this period differed fundamentally from traditional academic learning or professional development activities. Instead of studying theoretical concepts or abstract principles, Rachel was conducting real-time analysis of human behavior under stress, while simultaneously developing practical strategies for managing complex interpersonal challenges that would determine her future well-being and independence. Rachel's nursing education had provided extensive training in family systems theory and crisis intervention techniques, but her current situation offered opportunities to observe these concepts in operation within her own family structure. The theoretical knowledge she had gained through professional training was being tested and refined through direct observation of psychological defense mechanisms, communication dysfunction, and emotional manipulation tactics that textbooks could describe but not fully convey. The systematic approach Rachel developed for analyzing her family's conversations involved identifying recurring themes, communication patterns, and underlying motivations that revealed their authentic priorities and decision-making processes. She began cataloging specific examples of manipulative language, emotional appeals designed to deflect responsibility, and strategic omissions that distorted the truth about their circumstances and intentions. Miguel's communication style demonstrated sophisticated techniques for avoiding accountability, while maintaining the appearance of reasonable concern for family welfare. When discussing Rachel's potential long-term care needs, Miguel consistently framed his preferences in terms of practical necessity and financial responsibility, rather than acknowledging his underlying desire to minimize his personal obligations and preserve his lifestyle. His language suggested that transferring Rachel to institutional care would be best for everyone involved, including Rachel herself, despite evidence that his primary motivation was reducing family burden and expense. Carmen's approach to emotional manipulation was more subtle but equally revealing. She specialized in expressing concern and sacrifice in ways that generated guilt and obligation among family members, while positioning herself as the primary victim of difficult circumstances. Carmen's discussions about the sacrifices required for maintaining hospital vigil duties were designed to elicit appreciation and sympathy, rather than to genuinely assess what level of support was appropriate or sustainable during Rachel's recovery process. Sophia's communication patterns revealed a combination of entitlement and victimization that allowed her to avoid responsibility for her circumstances, while maintaining access to family resources and support. Her expressions of frustration about delayed job searching and limited independence consistently blamed external factors rather than acknowledging her own role in creating and perpetuating her dependence on Rachel's financial assistance. Carlos demonstrated perhaps the most sophisticated manipulation techniques, combining entrepreneurial optimism with financial desperation to create compelling narratives about business opportunities that required immediate family investment. His ability to present speculative ventures as sound financial decisions reflected years of practice in persuading Rachel to provide funding for projects that consistently failed to produce promised returns. The educational value of observing these communication patterns extended beyond simple identification of problematic behavior. Rachel was developing deep understanding of the psychological mechanisms that had made her susceptible to manipulation and the specific triggers that activated her people-pleasing responses. This self-awareness would be essential for establishing effective boundaries and maintaining emotional stability during future family interactions. Rachel recognized that her tendency to interpret ambiguous communication in the most charitable possible way had enabled her family's manipulation strategies while preventing her from recognizing obvious warning signs about their true motivations. Her default assumption that family members shared her values of mutual support and genuine concern had blinded her to evidence that their priorities and ethical frameworks differed fundamentally from her own. The intensive observation period also provided Rachel with opportunities to study the hospital staff's professional approaches to family communication and boundary management. Dr. Patricia Reeves demonstrated excellent techniques for presenting medical information clearly while maintaining appropriate emotional distance from family dynamics that could interfere with patient care. Her interactions with Rachel's family members were consistently professional and informative, without becoming personally invested in their decision-making processes or emotional reactions. The nursing staff's approaches to family management offered additional insights into effective boundary-setting strategies. The most competent nurses maintained empathetic concern for patient welfare while avoiding entanglement in family conflicts or manipulation attempts. They provided excellent medical care and emotional support, without accepting responsibility for resolving family dysfunction or accommodating unreasonable demands from relatives who struggled to accept medical realities. Jennifer Walsh, the hospital social worker, demonstrated particularly sophisticated techniques for addressing family dynamics that could interfere with patient recovery and discharge planning. Her conversations with Rachel's family members consistently focused on practical problem-solving, while deflecting attempts to draw her into emotional disputes or requests for validation of their perspectives and priorities. Rachel began developing a comprehensive framework for future family interactions based on the professional communication techniques she was observing, combined with insights gained through analyzing her family's manipulation strategies. This framework emphasized clear communication of expectations and boundaries, consistent enforcement of established limits, and emotional detachment from her family's reactions to her refusal to continue enabling their dysfunction. The educational process also included extensive reflection on Rachel's own psychological development and the experiences that had shaped her people-pleasing tendencies and boundary avoidance patterns. She recognized that her childhood role as the responsible oldest sibling had established expectations and relationship dynamics that had continued into adulthood without conscious examination or modification. Rachel's parents had consistently praised her for maturity and responsibility, while subtly communicating that her worth was contingent upon her ability to help manage family problems and support her siblings' success. This conditioning had created deep-seated beliefs about her obligations to prioritize family harmony over personal well-being, and to measure her value through her usefulness to others, rather than her inherent worth as an individual. The military culture that had influenced Rachel's marriage to David included both positive and problematic elements that had affected her approach to family relationships. The emphasis on service, sacrifice, and team loyalty had reinforced her natural inclination to prioritize others' needs, while the hierarchical structure and mission focus had provided less guidance for managing complex emotional relationships that required nuanced boundary setting and conflict resolution skills. Rachel's professional nursing experience had provided valuable training in therapeutic communication and family systems intervention, but the institutional context had limited her opportunities to practice these skills in personal relationships, where her own emotional investment complicated objective assessment and strategic response. The current situation was providing unprecedented opportunities to apply professional knowledge to personal circumstances, while developing deeper understanding of both individual psychology and family dynamics. The learning process that consumed Rachel's consciousness during these extended observation days included systematic analysis of her own emotional responses to her family's revealed attitudes and priorities. She needed to distinguish between grief about lost illusions and anger about genuine betrayal, while developing healthy coping strategies that would support her emotional stability during the difficult transition period ahead. Rachel recognized that her sense of devastation about her family's conversations reflected both legitimate disappointment about their selfishness and her own unrealistic expectations about family loyalty and unconditional love. The intensity of her emotional reaction indicated that she had maintained idealized beliefs about family relationships that were not supported by observable evidence or realistic assessment of human nature and motivational complexity. The educational value of processing these emotional responses included developing greater psychological sophistication about the difference between love and attachment, between genuine care and possessive control, and between healthy family support and dysfunctional enabling relationships. These distinctions would be essential for creating new relationship patterns that honored authentic connection while protecting individual autonomy and well-being. Rachel's analysis of her family's financial discussions provided particular insight into the economic dynamics that had enabled years of exploitation and dependence. She began calculating the actual costs of her family support over time, and comparing those expenses to the opportunities and security she had sacrificed through her inability to establish appropriate limits on her generosity. The financial education that emerged from this analysis included recognition that her family's dependence on her support had prevented them from developing essential life skills, including budgeting, financial planning, and problem-solving capabilities that would serve them well during independent adulthood. Her assistance had been counterproductive for their long-term development, while creating unsustainable burden for her own financial security and future planning. Rachel began developing specific strategies for transitioning her family toward financial independence, while protecting her own resources from continued exploitation. These strategies would need to balance her genuine desire for their success with realistic assessment of their willingness to accept responsibility for their circumstances and develop greater self-sufficiency. The comprehensive education that Rachel received during her extended observation period included preparation for the inevitable resistance and manipulation attempts that would accompany her establishment of new boundaries and expectations. Her family members had invested years in developing strategies for accessing her resources and emotional support, and they would likely employ sophisticated techniques for maintaining those advantages when confronted with evidence of their revealed priorities. Rachel studied examples of resistance techniques that appeared in her family's hospital conversations, noting their tendency to deflect accountability through claims of misunderstanding, temporary stress, or exceptional circumstances that justified their behavior. These patterns would likely intensify when Rachel confronted them directly about their attitudes and established new limits on her availability and support. The strategic preparation that consumed Rachel's mental energy during these days included detailed planning for multiple scenarios that could emerge once she revealed her consciousness and began implementing boundary changes. She needed contingency plans for aggressive resistance, emotional manipulation, threats of relationship termination, and potential attempts to undermine her credibility through claims about brain injury affecting her judgment and decision-making capacity. Rachel's professional experience with difficult family dynamics provided valuable perspective on the importance of maintaining consistent boundaries regardless of emotional pressure or manipulation attempts. The most successful interventions she had witnessed involved calm persistence and refusal to engage with defensive arguments or emotional appeals designed to restore previous dysfunctional patterns. The educational phase of Rachel's transformation was approaching completion as she developed comprehensive understanding of her family's psychological dynamics and practical strategies for managing the challenging transition ahead. The knowledge and insights she had gained through intensive observation and analysis would provide the foundation for implementing changes that would fundamentally alter her relationships while protecting her well-being and future security. Rachel understood that the real test of her education would begin once she emerged from her protected observation position and started applying her insights through direct communication and boundary enforcement. The learning process had provided essential preparation, but the practical implementation of change would require courage, persistence, and emotional resilience that could only be developed through experience and practice. The systematic education that Rachel had conducted during her extended locked-in period represented the most intensive and personally relevant learning experience of her adult life. The insights and strategies she had developed would serve her well during the challenging months ahead, as she rebuilt her relationships on foundations of mutual respect and authentic connection, rather than enabling an exploitation. On the morning of her 11th day in the intensive care unit, Rachel Martinez made the deliberate decision to reveal her consciousness to Dr. Patricia Reeves during the early morning neurological assessment. The timing of this revelation represented her first practical application of the strategic planning and psychological insights she had developed during her extended observation period. Rachel understood that emerging from her locked-in state would immediately initiate a series of challenging interactions that would test her ability to implement the boundary-setting strategies and communication techniques she had been mentally rehearsing. Dr. Reeves arrived for her morning rounds at precisely 7:15, maintaining the consistent schedule that Rachel had observed throughout her hospitalization. The neurosurgeon's professional demeanor and systematic approach to patient assessment had earned Rachel's respect and trust during the observation period, making Dr. Reeves the logical choice for the initial revelation of consciousness. Rachel recognized that medical professionals would provide objective validation of her cognitive function and decision-making capacity, establishing credibility that would be essential during subsequent family confrontations. When Dr. Reeves began conducting the standard neurological assessment, Rachel made the conscious choice to respond appropriately to verbal commands and physical stimuli. She squeezed Dr. Reeves' hand when requested, followed simple instructions to move her fingers and toes, and demonstrated appropriate eye tracking and blinking responses. The return of apparent neurological function was carefully calibrated to suggest gradual emergence from unconsciousness, rather than sudden awakening that might raise questions about the timeline of her recovery. Dr. Reeves immediately recognized the significance of Rachel's responses and began conducting more comprehensive cognitive assessments to evaluate her mental status and communication capabilities. Rachel demonstrated appropriate orientation to person, place, and time, while carefully concealing the full extent of her awareness about recent events and conversations. She needed to establish her competence and cognitive function without immediately revealing that she had been conscious during family discussions that were never intended for her awareness. The initial conversation between Rachel and Dr. Reeves provided opportunities for Rachel to demonstrate her professional knowledge and analytical capabilities, while seeking medical guidance about the ethical and practical implications of her extended observation period. Dr. Reeves was surprised and impressed by Rachel's sophisticated understanding of her medical condition and recovery process, recognizing that her nursing background had provided valuable context for processing her experience and developing realistic expectations about rehabilitation requirements. Rachel's first test of her newly developed communication strategies occurred when she explained to Dr. Reeves that she had been conscious but unable to communicate for several days prior to this official emergence. She presented this information as a medical phenomenon that had provided unexpected opportunities for observation and reflection, rather than as deliberate deception designed to gather intelligence about family dynamics. This framing allowed her to acknowledge her awareness without creating ethical complications for the medical team. Dr. Reeves was professionally intrigued by Rachel's description of the locked-in experience and requested detailed information about her sensory awareness, cognitive function, and emotional processing during the period of apparent unconsciousness. Rachel provided comprehensive responses that demonstrated both her medical knowledge and her psychological sophistication, while establishing her credibility as a reliable observer and decision-maker. The conversation between Rachel and Dr. Reeves also addressed the practical implications of Rachel's extended observation period and the insights she had gained about her family relationships. Dr. Reeves maintained appropriate professional boundaries while acknowledging that family dynamics during medical crises often revealed underlying dysfunction that could affect patient recovery and discharge planning. She offered to arrange consultation with the hospital social worker if Rachel needed professional guidance about managing difficult family situations. Rachel's second significant test occurred when she requested private consultation with Jennifer Walsh, the hospital social worker, before her family was informed about her return to consciousness. This request demonstrated her strategic thinking and her recognition that professional support would be valuable during the challenging conversations that would inevitably follow her emergence. Walsh's expertise in family systems and crisis intervention would provide essential guidance for implementing the boundary-setting strategies Rachel had developed. The consultation with Jennifer Walsh provided Rachel with opportunities to practice articulating her concerns about family dynamics, while receiving professional validation of her observations and strategic planning. Walsh was experienced in recognizing family dysfunction and manipulation tactics, and she immediately understood the significance of Rachel's descriptions about overheard conversations and revealed priorities during her family's unguarded discussions. Walsh's professional assessment confirmed Rachel's analysis of her family's manipulative communication patterns and financial exploitation strategies. The social worker provided additional insights about enabling behaviors and codependent relationships that had characterized Rachel's family interactions for years. Walsh also offered practical guidance about establishing healthy boundaries and managing the resistance and manipulation attempts that typically accompanied such changes. The consultation with Walsh included discussion of legal and financial protections that Rachel might need to implement to safeguard her resources and independence during the transition to healthier family relationships. Walsh recommended consultation with attorneys who specialized in asset protection and estate planning to ensure that Rachel's financial security could not be compromised by family members who might attempt to claim authority over her affairs based on her medical condition. Rachel's third test involved making contact with David before revealing her consciousness to her family members. The conversation with her husband would require her to communicate complex information about family dysfunction, while seeking his support for the difficult boundary-setting process that lay ahead. David's military training and deployment experience had provided him with strategic thinking capabilities that would be valuable for developing comprehensive approaches to the challenges Rachel was facing. The phone conversation with David occurred during his transport back to Norfolk from his deployment location. Rachel's ability to speak coherently and demonstrate cognitive function provided immediate reassurance about her recovery prospects, while allowing her to share the disturbing revelations about their family's true priorities and motivations. David's response to this information would serve as an important indicator of their marriage's potential for recovery and growth through honest communication about the issues that had created tension between them. David's initial reaction to Rachel's consciousness and the information about family conversations was a mixture of relief about her medical recovery and anger about her relatives, revealed attitudes toward her welfare. His military experience had provided extensive exposure to family dynamics under stress, and he immediately recognized the significance of Rachel's observations about manipulative communication patterns and exploitative financial relationships. The conversation with David also addressed the strain that Rachel's family obligations had placed on their marriage and their shared financial goals. David acknowledged that he had been frustrated by Rachel's inability to establish appropriate boundaries with her relatives, but he had not fully understood the sophisticated manipulation techniques that had made boundary setting so psychologically difficult for her. The revelations about her family's true priorities provided context that helped David understand Rachel's previous struggles with assertiveness and independence. David's support for Rachel's planned boundary-setting initiatives represented a crucial validation of her strategic thinking and decision-making capabilities. His willingness to stand with her during potentially difficult family confrontations would provide essential emotional support, while demonstrating to her relatives that their marriage was united around shared priorities and values, rather than divided by competing loyalties and obligations. Rachel's fourth test involved developing specific language and strategies for the initial conversation with her family about her returned consciousness. This conversation would need to establish her cognitive competence and decision-making authority, while setting the foundation for subsequent discussions about boundary changes and relationship modifications. The communication needed to be clear and professional, without revealing the full extent of her knowledge about their private conversations. The preparation for family communication included careful consideration of timing, setting, and participant selection that would optimize Rachel's ability to control the conversation's direction and prevent manipulation attempts from derailing her message. Rachel decided to request individual conversations with each family member rather than attempting to address the entire group simultaneously, recognizing that private discussions would be more effective for delivering difficult information and managing defensive reactions. Rachel's fifth test occurred when she asked Dr. Reeves to inform her family about her return to consciousness and arrange for brief individual visits during which Rachel could demonstrate her cognitive function and begin establishing new communication patterns. This structured approach would allow Rachel to practice her boundary-setting techniques in controlled circumstances while receiving professional support if family members became aggressive or manipulative in their responses. The individual conversations with family members provided immediate opportunities for Rachel to observe how each relative responded to her emergence and cognitive competence. Their reactions would reveal important information about their psychological flexibility and their willingness to accept changes in their relationship dynamics. Rachel was particularly interested in observing whether her family members expressed genuine relief about her recovery, or whether their responses focused primarily on restoring access to her financial and emotional support. Miguel's initial reaction to Rachel's consciousness included appropriate expressions of gratitude and relief, but his questions quickly shifted to practical matters about her recovery timeline and her ability to resume normal activities and responsibilities. His inquiries about when she might return to work and whether her cognitive function would be permanently affected suggested that his primary concerns related to her future ability to provide financial assistance rather than her personal well-being and comfort. Carmen's response demonstrated sophisticated emotional manipulation techniques designed to generate guilt about the stress and sacrifice that Rachel's condition had created for the family. She emphasized the disruption to family schedules and the financial costs of maintaining hospital presence, while expressing hope that Rachel's recovery would allow them to return to normal family functioning and mutual support patterns. Sophia's conversation with Rachel revealed underlying resentment about the impact of Rachel's hospitalization on her personal goals and lifestyle preferences. Sophia's complaints about delayed job searching and limited social activities suggested that she viewed Rachel's medical crisis primarily in terms of its inconvenience for her own plans, rather than as a serious health situation requiring family support and understanding. Carlos approached his conversation with Rachel from a strategic perspective designed to restore access to financial support for his business ventures. He mentioned several opportunities that had been delayed due to family focus on Rachel's medical situation and expressed hope that her recovery would allow him to pursue those opportunities with appropriate family investment and encouragement. The pattern that emerged from these individual conversations confirmed Rachel's analysis of her family's priorities and motivations while providing practical experience with implementing boundary-setting communication techniques. Each family member demonstrated more concern about restoring previous relationship patterns than about understanding Rachel's experience or supporting her recovery process according to her own needs and preferences. Rachel's first test of direct boundary setting occurred when Carlos requested immediate financial assistance for a business opportunity that required quick action before competitors could secure the same advantages. Rachel's response to this request would establish the foundation for all subsequent boundary enforcement and family relationship modifications. Rachel declined Carlos's request using clear, factual language that focused on her current medical situation and recovery priorities, rather than engaging with his arguments about opportunity costs and timing pressures. She explained that her medical absence from work had created financial constraints that required careful resource management during her recovery period. This response established her authority over financial decisions while avoiding defensive arguments about Carlos's business judgment or his history of failed ventures. Carlos's reaction to Rachel's boundary setting provided valuable information about his psychological flexibility and his willingness to accept modified relationship dynamics. His immediate attempts to persuade her to reconsider the decision and his expressions of disappointment about her changed priorities confirmed Rachel's analysis of his manipulative communication patterns while validating her decision to establish firmer boundaries around financial assistance. The first test of Rachel's transformation had demonstrated both the effectiveness of her strategic preparation and the challenges that lay ahead during the comprehensive relationship restructuring process. Her ability to maintain emotional stability and clear communication despite family pressure and manipulation attempts indicated that her extended observation period had provided valuable preparation for the difficult work of establishing healthier family dynamics based on mutual respect rather than enabling and exploitation. Within 48 hours of Rachel Martinez's emergence from her medically induced unconsciousness, her family members had mobilized a sophisticated campaign of resistance designed to restore the previous relationship dynamics that had provided them with reliable access to her financial and emotional resources. The intensity and coordination of their response demonstrated the extent to which they had become dependent upon Rachel's enabling behaviors, and their unwillingness to accept the boundary changes she was implementing as part of her recovery and personal transformation process. The resistance began with Miguel and Carmen Herrera's coordinated effort to undermine Rachel's credibility by suggesting that her brain injury had affected her judgment and decision-making capabilities. They approached Dr. Patricia Reeves with concerns about Rachel's apparent personality changes and her sudden reluctance to discuss family matters or provide the emotional support that had previously characterized their relationship. Miguel and Carmen framed their concerns in terms of medical worry rather than acknowledging their primary motivation to restore access to Rachel's financial assistance and problem-solving services. Dr. Reeves responded to these inquiries with professional explanations about traumatic brain injury recovery and the possibility that patients might experience temporary changes in personality or priorities during the healing process. However, her clinical assessment of Rachel's cognitive function and decision-making capacity indicated no impairment that would justify concerns about competence or judgment. Dr. Reeves explained that many trauma patients experienced shifts in perspective about relationships and priorities following life-threatening accidents, and that such changes often represented healthy psychological processing rather than medical complications. The medical team's validation of Rachel's cognitive competence and decision-making authority represented a significant obstacle to her family's attempts to discredit her boundary-setting efforts. Rachel had anticipated this particular resistance strategy and had deliberately established her professional credibility with Dr. Reeves and Jennifer Walsh before revealing her knowledge about family conversations. The foundation of medical and social work support would prove essential during the escalating manipulation attempts that followed her initial boundary enforcement. Sofia Herrera implemented a different resistance strategy that combined emotional manipulation with appeals to family loyalty and shared history. She approached Rachel with tearful expressions of concern about their deteriorating relationship and confusion about Rachel's apparent withdrawal from family intimacy and mutual support. Sofia characterized Rachel's boundary setting as coldness and selfishness, rather than acknowledging the exploitative patterns that had prompted these protective measures. Sofia's emotional appeals were carefully designed to activate Rachel's people-pleasing tendencies and her deeply ingrained beliefs about family obligations and loyalty. She emphasized the sacrifices that the family had made during Rachel's hospitalization, while expressing hurt and disappointment about Rachel's failure to appreciate their dedication and concern. Sofia presented herself as a victim of Rachel's changed priorities, rather than acknowledging her own role in creating exploitative relationship dynamics. Rachel's response to Sofia's emotional manipulation represented a crucial test of her newly developed boundary-setting skills and her ability to maintain perspective despite psychological pressure designed to generate guilt and compliance. Rachel acknowledged Sofia's feelings while declining to accept responsibility for them or to modify her boundaries in response to emotional appeals. She explained that her recovery process required her to prioritize her own healing and well-being, rather than immediately resuming previous levels of availability for family crisis management. The conversation with Sofia revealed the sophisticated nature of the psychological conditioning that had enabled years of exploitation and boundary violations. Sofia expressed genuine confusion about Rachel's refusal to resume previous patterns of financial assistance and emotional caretaking, demonstrating that she had never recognized the inappropriateness of her dependence or the burden it had placed on Rachel's resources and well-being. Sofia's bewilderment suggested that she had internalized beliefs about Rachel's obligations that would require significant education and boundary enforcement to modify. Carlos Herrera's resistance strategy focused on practical arguments about business opportunities and financial timing that attempted to override Rachel's boundary decisions through logic and persuasion rather than emotional manipulation. He approached Rachel with detailed business plans and financial projections designed to demonstrate the rationality of his funding requests and the potential returns that would benefit the entire family if Rachel provided the necessary investment capital. Carlos's business presentations were professionally formatted and included market research, competitive analysis, and financial forecasting that appeared to address previous concerns about the viability of his entrepreneurial ventures. However, Rachel's extended observation period had provided insights into Carlos's pattern of presenting optimistic projections that consistently failed to materialize into actual profits or sustainable business operations. His current proposals reflected the same unrealistic expectations and inadequate risk assessment that had characterized his previous failed ventures. Rachel's response to Carlos's business presentations demonstrated her growing sophistication in evaluating family manipulation attempts and maintaining boundaries despite sophisticated persuasion techniques. She acknowledged the apparent quality of his research and planning, while declining to provide funding based on her current financial constraints and recovery priorities. Rachel avoided engaging with arguments about business viability or opportunity costs, recognizing that such discussions would provide Carlos with opportunities to employ additional persuasion strategies. Carlos's reaction to Rachel's boundary enforcement revealed underlying anger and entitlement that had been concealed beneath previous expressions of gratitude and family affection. He accused Rachel of selfishness and failure to support family success, suggesting that her boundary setting represented a fundamental betrayal of family loyalty and mutual assistance obligations. Carlos's emotional escalation confirmed Rachel's assessment of his manipulative capabilities and his unwillingness to accept responsibility for his own financial circumstances. The most intensive resistance campaign emerged from the coordinated efforts of all 4 family members to isolate Rachel from external support systems and professional guidance that were enabling her boundary-setting success. Miguel, Carmen, Sofia, and Carlos began questioning the advice Rachel was receiving from medical professionals and social workers, suggesting that these outsiders did not understand their family dynamics or appreciate the importance of maintaining traditional family relationships and mutual support patterns. The family's attacks on Rachel's professional support network represented a sophisticated manipulation strategy designed to undermine her confidence in her own judgment while restoring their influence over her decision-making processes. They characterized Dr. Reeves and Jennifer Walsh as interfering outsiders who were encouraging Rachel to abandon family loyalty in favor of selfish individualism that would ultimately leave her isolated and unsupported during future crises. Rachel recognized this isolation strategy as a classic component of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse, confirming her analysis of the unhealthy dynamics that had characterized her family relationships for years. The family's coordinated effort to discredit her professional supporters demonstrated their recognition that Rachel's access to objective validation and strategic guidance represented a significant threat to their ability to restore previous exploitation patterns. The resistance intensified when David Martinez returned from his deployment and immediately demonstrated support for Rachel's boundary-setting efforts and her analysis of family dysfunction. David's military training had provided extensive experience with manipulation tactics and psychological pressure techniques, enabling him to recognize and counter the family's attempts to undermine Rachel's confidence and decision-making authority. His presence provided additional validation of Rachel's perspective while offering practical support during difficult family confrontations. Miguel and Carmen's response to David's support for Rachel's boundary changes included attempts to drive a wedge between the married couple by suggesting that David's military service had made him insensitive to family relationships and civilian emotional needs. They characterized his support for Rachel's boundaries as evidence of military callousness, rather than recognizing it as appropriate spousal loyalty and shared commitment to healthy relationship dynamics. The family's attempts to manipulate David represented a significant miscalculation in their resistance strategy. David's military experience had provided extensive training in recognizing and countering psychological manipulation attempts, and his deployment experience had taught him to evaluate situations based on observable evidence rather than emotional appeals or social pressure. David's analysis of the family dynamics confirmed Rachel's observations while providing additional perspective on the sophisticated nature of their manipulation techniques. Sophia escalated her resistance efforts by threatening to terminate her relationship with Rachel entirely if the boundary changes continued. She presented this threat as a natural consequence of Rachel's selfish behavior rather than acknowledging it as an attempt to coerce compliance through fear of abandonment. Sophia's ultimatum was designed to activate Rachel's deep-seated fears about family rejection and isolation, while pressuring her to choose between self-protection and family acceptance. Rachel's response to Sophia's abandonment threat represented perhaps the most significant test of her transformation from people-pleasing enabler to self-advocating individual. Rather than capitulating to Sophia's emotional blackmail, Rachel expressed sadness about Sophia's decision while acknowledging her right to choose the level of relationship she wanted to maintain. Rachel's willingness to accept the potential loss of family relationships, rather than return to exploitative patterns, demonstrated the depth of her commitment to personal growth and healthy boundaries. Carlos attempted to escalate the pressure by involving extended family members and family friends in campaigns designed to convince Rachel that her boundary setting represented unreasonable and harmful behavior toward people who loved and depended upon her support. These third-party intervention attempts were carefully orchestrated to create social pressure and community disapproval that would motivate Rachel to restore previous relationship patterns rather than continue implementing protective boundaries. The extended family intervention campaign included phone calls from relatives who expressed concern about family unity and traditional values, while pressuring Rachel to reconsider her changed approach to family relationships. These intervention attempts were presented as loving concern rather than manipulation, but their coordinated timing and consistent messaging revealed the strategic planning that had organized the resistance campaign. Rachel's response to extended family pressure demonstrated her growing sophistication in recognizing and countering manipulation attempts regardless of their source or apparent motivation. She thanked relatives for their concern while declining to discuss the details of her family relationships, or to accept guidance from people who lacked complete information about the circumstances that had prompted her boundary changes. Rachel's refusal to engage with third-party manipulation attempts effectively neutralized this resistance strategy, while maintaining respect for family relationships that were not directly exploitative. The resistance campaign reached its peak when Miguel and Carmen threatened to pursue legal action designed to establish guardianship or conservatorship over Rachel's affairs, based on claims that her brain injury had compromised her decision-making capacity and judgment. This threat represented the most aggressive manipulation attempt and demonstrated the extent to which her family was willing to escalate their efforts to restore access to her financial resources and decision-making authority. The legal threat also revealed the desperation underlying the family's resistance efforts and their recognition that Rachel's boundary changes represented a fundamental shift in family dynamics rather than temporary changes that could be reversed through persistence and pressure. The willingness to pursue legal action against Rachel demonstrated that their concern for her well-being was secondary to their desire to maintain access to her resources and support. Rachel's response to the legal threats included immediate consultation with attorneys who specialized in disability rights and family law, ensuring that her interests would be protected if her family attempted to follow through on their intimidation efforts. The legal consultation provided additional validation of Rachel's cognitive competence, while establishing professional protection against potential future manipulation attempts that might involve court proceedings or official challenges to her autonomy. The comprehensive resistance campaign that Rachel's family had implemented over several weeks following her emergence from unconsciousness provided definitive confirmation of their priorities and their willingness to employ sophisticated manipulation techniques to achieve their objectives. The intensity and coordination of their efforts demonstrated that Rachel's boundary setting represented a significant threat to their lifestyle and financial security, validating her analysis of the exploitative nature of their previous relationship patterns. Rachel's successful navigation of this resistance period without capitulating to family pressure or abandoning her boundary-setting efforts represented a crucial milestone in her transformation from enabler to self-advocate. The experience had tested her resilience, strategic thinking, and commitment to personal growth while providing practical education about implementing and maintaining healthy boundaries despite intense opposition and manipulation attempts. Rachel Martinez's transformation reached its pivotal moment during a comprehensive family confrontation that occurred 3 weeks after her discharge from Centera Norfolk General Hospital. The confrontation had been precipitated by her family's escalating manipulation attempts and their unsuccessful legal consultation regarding potential guardianship proceedings. Rachel recognized that decisive action was required to establish permanent boundaries and communicate the full extent of her knowledge about their revealed priorities and manipulative behaviors. The breakthrough moment began when Rachel made the strategic decision to schedule a formal family meeting at her home, where she would control the environment and timing while presenting comprehensive evidence of their exploitative relationship patterns. This approach represented a fundamental shift from reactive boundary setting to proactive confrontation, designed to address the underlying dysfunction that had characterized their relationships for years. Rachel understood that partial disclosure and gradual boundary implementation had proven insufficient to modify her family's behavior or achieve the relationship changes necessary for her continued well-being. The preparation for this confrontation required Rachel to synthesize everything she had learned during her observation period, her strategic planning phase, and her experience navigating family resistance efforts. She developed a structured presentation that would address each family member's specific manipulation techniques while providing clear evidence of their revealed attitudes and priorities. The presentation needed to be comprehensive enough to prevent denial or minimization, while remaining focused on observable behaviors rather than interpretations or assumptions about motivations. Rachel's nursing background provided valuable perspective on conducting difficult family meetings that addressed sensitive information while maintaining professional composure and clear communication objectives. Her experience with family conferences during medical crises had taught her the importance of structured agendas, specific examples, and predetermined outcomes that would guide the conversation toward productive resolution rather than allowing it to devolve into emotional arguments or defensive diversions. David Martinez's presence during the confrontation provided essential support and validation, while demonstrating unified spousal commitment to the boundary changes Rachel was implementing. His military training had equipped him with strategic thinking capabilities and communication skills that would prove valuable for managing family resistance and manipulation attempts during what was likely to be a highly charged emotional encounter. David's role would include providing objective perspective and preventing Rachel from being overwhelmed by coordinated family pressure tactics. The family meeting commenced with Rachel's clear statement that she had been conscious and aware during specific conversations that had occurred while she was believed to be unconscious in the intensive care unit. This revelation immediately established the foundation for her subsequent presentation, while preventing family members from claiming ignorance about the behaviors and attitudes that had prompted her boundary changes. The disclosure that Rachel had overheard their private discussions created immediate accountability for statements and decisions they had believed were unobserved. Rachel's presentation of specific examples from overheard conversations was delivered with clinical precision and professional detachment that prevented family members from redirecting the discussion toward emotional manipulation or defensive arguments. She quoted exact statements about their primary concerns regarding her potential death or disability, their discussions about dividing her possessions, and their expressions of frustration about the inconvenience her medical crisis had created for their personal plans and financial arrangements. The impact of Rachel's detailed recounting of their private conversations was immediate and devastating to her family's attempts to maintain their previous narrative about loving concern and family loyalty. Miguel and Carmen were confronted with direct evidence of their discussions about insurance benefits and long-term care costs that would minimize their financial obligations and caregiving responsibilities. Sofia and Carlos faced documentation of their complaints about delayed personal opportunities and their strategic planning for accessing Rachel's resources during her anticipated recovery period. Miguel's initial response involved attempts to minimize the significance of the overheard conversations by characterizing them as stress-induced comments that did not reflect their genuine feelings about Rachel's welfare. He argued that families naturally discussed practical matters during medical crises and that focusing on financial concerns did not indicate absence of love or commitment to her recovery and well-being. Miguel's defensive strategy reflected the manipulation techniques Rachel had observed during her locked-in period, confirming her analysis of his communication patterns. Carmen's reaction included emotional appeals designed to generate guilt about Rachel's decision to confront them with private conversations that had been conducted during a period of extreme stress and uncertainty. She characterized Rachel's disclosure as a violation of family privacy and trust while expressing hurt about Rachel's apparent willingness to judge their character based on comments made during the most difficult period of their family's history. Carmen's response demonstrated the sophisticated emotional manipulation techniques that had enabled years of exploitation. Sophia's confrontation with evidence of her revealed attitudes produced defensive anger rather than acknowledgement or remorse about her exploitative behaviors. She accused Rachel of deliberate deception during her apparent unconsciousness, and questioned the ethics of gathering information through misrepresentation of her medical condition. Sophia's reaction revealed underlying entitlement and resentment that confirmed Rachel's assessment of her character and her unwillingness to accept responsibility for her dependence and manipulation. Carlos's response focused on practical arguments about business opportunities and financial timing that attempted to minimize the significance of his revealed priorities while restoring focus to his current funding needs and entrepreneurial ventures. He argued that his business discussions during Rachel's hospitalization had been motivated by concern for family financial security rather than personal gain, demonstrating his continued commitment to manipulation strategies, despite direct confrontation with evidence of his exploitative attitudes. The family's coordinated defensive responses provided Rachel with real-time confirmation of the manipulation techniques she had studied during her observation period, while demonstrating their continued commitment to exploitation rather than genuine relationship repair or acknowledgement of harmful behaviors. Their inability to express authentic remorse or accept responsibility for their revealed attitudes validated Rachel's decision to implement comprehensive boundaries, rather than attempting gradual relationship modification. Rachel's breakthrough moment occurred when she recognized that her family's defensive reactions had eliminated any remaining uncertainty about their priorities and their commitment to maintaining exploitative relationship patterns. The confrontation had provided definitive evidence that they viewed her primarily as a resource rather than as a beloved family member deserving of unconditional love and respect. This clarity enabled Rachel to proceed with confidence in implementing the comprehensive boundary changes she had planned. The presentation of financial documentation represented the most powerful component of Rachel's confrontation strategy. She had prepared detailed calculations showing the total amount of money she had provided to family members over the previous 5 years, including direct transfers, loan payments, bill coverage, and emergency assistance that had never been repaid. The financial analysis demonstrated that her family support had exceeded $100,000 while significantly compromising her own financial security and retirement planning. The financial documentation also included comparison data showing how Rachel's contributions to family members compared to typical family assistance patterns and appropriate intergenerational support levels. The analysis revealed that her support had exceeded reasonable family assistance by substantial margins, while creating unhealthy dependence relationships that had prevented her relatives from developing essential financial management skills and independence capabilities. Rachel's presentation of this financial information was accompanied by clear statements about her future availability for family assistance and the specific boundaries she would maintain regarding financial requests and emergency support. She explained that her medical crisis had provided perspective on the unsustainable nature of her previous support levels and the necessity of prioritizing her own financial security and recovery needs during the rehabilitation period and beyond. The family's reaction to the financial analysis revealed the extent to which they had become dependent upon Rachel's support while taking that assistance for granted, rather than appreciating it as extraordinary generosity that exceeded normal family obligations. Their immediate concerns focused on how they would manage their financial obligations without Rachel's continued support, rather than acknowledging gratitude for the substantial assistance she had provided, or expressing understanding about her need to establish sustainable boundaries. Miguel and Carmen's response to the financial documentation included arguments about family loyalty and mutual support obligations that attempted to characterize Rachel's boundary setting as abandonment of fundamental family values. They suggested that Rachel's focus on financial calculations demonstrated selfishness and lack of appreciation for the emotional support and family connection they had provided throughout her life. Their arguments reflected sophisticated manipulation techniques designed to generate guilt while avoiding accountability for their exploitative behaviors. Sophia's reaction to the financial analysis included expressions of shock about the total amount of assistance Rachel had provided, suggesting that she had not fully understood the extent of her dependence or the burden it had placed on Rachel's resources. However, Sophia's surprise was accompanied by immediate concerns about how she would manage her expenses without continued family support, rather than acknowledgement of the inappropriateness of her dependence or gratitude for Rachel's previous generosity. Carlos's response to the financial documentation involved arguments about investment returns and business development that attempted to reframe his requests for assistance as mutually beneficial financial arrangements, rather than acknowledging them as one-sided transfers that had never produced promised returns. His continued focus on future business opportunities, despite confrontation with evidence of previous failures, demonstrated his commitment to manipulation strategies and his inability to accept responsibility for his financial circumstances. The breakthrough moment reached its culmination when Rachel delivered her prepared statement about the permanent changes she was implementing in her family relationships. She explained that her medical crisis had provided clarity about the unsustainable and unhealthy nature of their previous patterns, while her recovery process had equipped her with knowledge and strategies for establishing healthier boundaries based on mutual respect rather than exploitation and enabling. Rachel's statement included specific descriptions of the boundaries she would maintain regarding financial assistance, emergency availability, and emotional support responsibilities. She explained that future family interactions would be based on voluntary participation and mutual enjoyment, rather than obligation and guilt-based manipulation. Rachel also communicated her expectations for respectful communication and her unwillingness to tolerate continued manipulation attempts or emotional abuse designed to restore previous relationship patterns. The family's reaction to Rachel's boundary statement confirmed her assessment of their priorities and their unwillingness to accept relationship changes that would require them to develop greater independence and self-sufficiency. Their immediate responses focused on the practical implications of her boundaries for their own circumstances, rather than expressing understanding about her need for self-protection or acknowledgement of the validity of her concerns about their previous behaviors. David's contribution to the confrontation included validation of Rachel's analysis and clear communication of his support for the boundary changes she was implementing. His military perspective provided additional credibility for Rachel's strategic thinking, while demonstrating unified spousal commitment to healthy relationship patterns. David's presence also served to counteract family attempts to isolate Rachel or undermine her confidence in her decision-making capabilities. The breakthrough moment concluded with Rachel's recognition that she had successfully communicated her knowledge about family dysfunction while establishing clear expectations for future interactions. The confrontation had eliminated ambiguity about her awareness of their manipulative behaviors and her commitment to maintaining protective boundaries regardless of their resistance efforts. Rachel's ability to remain composed and strategic throughout the emotional intensity of the confrontation demonstrated the effectiveness of her preparation and the depth of her transformation. The immediate aftermath of the breakthrough confrontation revealed the fundamental choice that each family member would need to make between accepting Rachel's boundaries and potentially losing access to her support and companionship. Their responses would determine whether any of their relationships could be salvaged on healthier foundations, or whether Rachel would need to maintain permanent distance from family members who remained committed to exploitation and manipulation rather than genuine connection and mutual respect. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.